quarter past, so it's time to begin this. It's a great pleasure to welcome Lars Boje Mortensen. He is a D-IAS Chair of Humanities, and he is a center leader of the DT Center for Medieval Literature. He's been president here for the last 6 years and has been approved for continuation over the next 4 years. Lars, I think you've studied saints, correct? Anyway,
that's true.
and generally has a background in a range of areas in the study of history, historiography, and not the least, medieval linguistic expressions. Now we're going to share this speech with us, and we're very much looking forward for it, and thanks very much for it.
Yeah, thank you, Torbjørn, and I'm going to defend the humanist colors here and actually read at least most of my paper. We'll start off with a Latin quotation. Yeah, maybe you have seen the title here, From Family Honor to Abstract Communities, a Literary Sociology of the Middle Ages. And this is work that's in a way just begun, so this is not published work. Privilegia paucorum non faciunt legem communem. The privileges of the few do not make a common law. Today, this could very well be used as a comment on the Brexit negotiations and English exceptionalism, or it could be a quotation from the Bernie Sanders campaign. It was, in fact, something more like the former, explaining the fact that some countries or powers that do not belong to the general order and have exceptional status cannot be an argument against the rationality of the empire, or we would say today, against the rationality of the EU. But I would like to use this actually as an entry point into my talk about social privilege too, so the Bernie Sanders version. Although the 1% were getting away with it, even more in the Middle Ages than they are today, the way we talk and argue about social privilege has undergone a complete turnaround, which will be helpful to get on the map first. Before I can approach the more specific problem, how to understand the social role of writing and of intellectuals in a dynamic period of pre-modern Europe, and how to study how the study of literature and learning can contribute methodologically and substantially to historical sociology. For those of you who don't read medieval literature on a regular basis, I have picked my first example from a story that you have probably heard of in some form, namely that of the Holy Grail, as it was introduced by the poet Chrétien de Troyes at the end of the 12th century. The motive of the Grail, the chalice that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, enjoys both Monty Python and Indiana Jones fame, or if you prefer 19th century spectacle, Wagner's Parsifal, which also brought it into the mainstream. The hero of Chrétien's poem is the young Parsifal, whose mother, at the outset of the history of the story, had decided to bring him up in safety and isolation from the big world. She has lost both her husband and 2 other sons through knightly combat. Of course, her plan backfires, and Parsifal becomes fascinated with knights and brave deeds and joins the court of King Arthur. Here, the uneducated young man turns out to be a very good, fast learner of both warfare skills and courtly manners. His further adventures with the Grail you may study yourselves. There is only one point of the plot that I want to draw your attention to here. Percival is unaware of the identity of his father or of the family of his mother, but as he comes to realize, he can in fact boast the most noble warrior blood on both sides, which easily explains his own talents. The career he picked was already in his blood and in his right of birth. You will recognize this theme from a number of other pre-modern adventures, novels, plays, etc. So the hero or the heroine is gradually unveiled as the true heir of greatness, and special powers handed on through his or her ancestral bloodline. And you are allowed to think of Star Wars here, which of course too imitates the medieval adventure world. But this motif made much more sense in the pre-modern world and is not one that is easily found in contemporary literature. The idea that the bloodline sets the few apart and that their characters are more powerful, virtuous, beautiful, moral, skilled, intelligent, and simply entitled through their birth is, however, found in mainstream ancient and medieval literature, in comedies, novels, romances, and so on. Arguing for the privilege of the 1% today is a completely different game. Although family privilege obviously still exists and runs the world to a large extent, it can no longer function as an argument. Because of the ideal modern entitlement and freedom of every citizen in our democracies, and because of the communicative and inclusive rationality guiding our discourse, to speak with Habermas, the privileged must name other causes than inborn superiority to advance their position. A very recent Danish example was the passing of a law substantially reducing the tax of family business inheritances. A group of rich businessmen had been lobbying and buying their way into the government parties of Venstre and Liberal Alliance, and the argument was that this was about the common good. First, it would create jobs. Second, if it were you, how would you feel about delivering 15% of the value that you had built up through your company? In other words, it concerned us all. It could have been you instead of this millionaire. In brief, I will call the medieval argument for privilege aristocratic and the modern one meritocratic. It is about who has earned and deserved their position through competence and work. The aristocratic order in Europe was dominant into the 18th and 19th centuries, but meritocratic attitudes were emerging already in the high and late Middle Ages, and very much so in the early modern period of the 16th and 17th centuries. My argument in today's talk will be that the emergence of meritocratic voices and ideas are linked also to literature and learning, and they cannot be accounted for only by the rise of new classes in society, for instance, the merchants and the artisans. To understand these links properly, we must also tie them to factors of societal organization, cultural memory, and written discourse itself. In other words, I'm making the case that literature and learning do not only reflect social changes, but also assists in opening a new space in which this dynamic can emerge. First, we must take a detour and look a little closer at the aristocratic order and the pre-modern obsession with the status and power of the dynasties and their leading individuals. The arbitrary aristocratic family structures completely they completely set the political agenda, and they were always the guiding argument. If you happen to watch the new Danish TV series on the history of Denmark, you will have noticed that in the medieval episodes how everything was dependent on an heir to the throne. To illustrate this strong dynastical principle, we could take examples from all over medieval or early modern Europe, and this could be an image of the aristocratic order. It's the wonderful Bamberg Reiter from around 1230, and the colors here are virtually added, but they must have been colored in the Middle Ages. I have picked Sicily just as a random example of how this dynastic principle works. So Sicily had been conquered and organized into a thriving kingdom by Norman knights during the 11th and 12th century. But in 1194, the German king and emperor of the Hohenstaufen family, Henry VI, conquered Sicily claiming it through his marriage with Constance, the daughter of the previous and highly successful Norman king Roger II. And the literary reference here is Ivanhoe, which you might have seen or read, because the big ransom for Richard Lionheart was actually used by Henry to conquer Sicily in Russia. Taking over Sicily for the Hohenstaufen dynasty only had a lasting effect because the couple had one son, the remarkable Frederick II, who against all odds was able to claim the Sicilian throne and came to dominate the Mediterranean and imperial politics until his death in 1250. And this is a German 19th century fantasy of the multicultural court of Frederick II in Sicily. And you see here he's receiving his Arab subjects or Muslim subjects. His father had died when he was 3 and his mother the year after, but he survived, and as a teenager he was able to wrest both the imperial throne and the kingdom of Sicily and Naples from other contenders. Frederick's last heir, here he is, this is a medieval image of Frederick II on a coin, and here is the dynasty. So Frederick's last heir, his grandson Conradin, was finally defeated by an alliance of the papacy and the powerful brother of the French king, Charles of Anjou. And to demonstrate that this was really the end of the dynasty, Charles spectacularly beheaded the young Conradin at the central square in Naples in 1268. And this is another German 19th century fantasy of that, the righteous Germans suffering at the hands of the nasty French. And this is, of course, this picture was painted in 1870, so just at the Franco-Prussian War. Charles of Anjou, his rule of Sicily became increasingly unpopular with the local barons, who united with other great powers and rebelled against the French at the famous Sicilian Vespers uprising in 1282. Strikingly again, a dynastic argument was needed and found in the rebels' ally Peter III of Aragon, who was married to the last surviving grandchild of Frederick II, also named Constance, like his mother. In this way, political fortunes were completely dependent on blood relations, and aristocratic women were almost always subject to forced marriages to tie one great family to another. This phenomenon mostly goes unanalyzed in ordinary history books. It is simply taken for granted that inheritance of lands and hence of the political and economical power worked like that. The bloodline principle, which created so much confusion, instability, and jeopardized long-term planning by the chance survival of a very few people, was not only determining events at the level of royal or potentially royal dynasties, but was operative for all significant landowners. If you let the map of medieval Europe evolve, the political map of medieval Europe evolve before your eyes, you would see a lot of quick changes all the time. Unfortunately, I couldn't find exactly this animation, but you would find very, very quick changes all the time. And these were not due to conquest, but they were due to haphazard family connections, marriages, deaths, and so on. To understand better how this very poor organizational principle was accepted by everyone, we have to pause a moment and consider what it would really be like to live in a society of relatively few resources and so many risks. While modern historians have a tendency to focus on kings and powerful lords and see their policies as simply optimizing autocratic domination over peasants, artisans and merchants, partly in competition with each other and partly in competition with the other great landowner, the church, we should not forget that the lower strata in society placed great hopes in their lords and rulers. They did not have much else to cling to, except perhaps a rival lord whom they would then have to hope lived longer. We have to remember that seen from the middle or the bottom of the medieval power hierarchies, the lords were not only oppressors of the or the 1%, they were equally the only source of protection and justice. The immense awe, respect, and hope that a lord, king, bishop, or pope could inspire was an effect of a person-centered society with weak institutions, but those feelings of belonging and hope were no less real for that. The less secure one's life situation, the more fragile your alliance to a certain nobleman or bishop who might pass away tomorrow, the greater the emotional investment, often turning into devotion and expressed in religious terms. This also helps to explain why the heirs were extremely important. Everything was invested in the only bond of continuity that was visible, the bond of blood, and therefore kinship and dynasty carried so much social weight for high and low. In both classical and medieval literature, we find abundant praise of both living and dead rulers, so abundant that we, as modern readers, cannot help smiling, or perhaps thinking of modern autocratic regimes. But this is a false analogy. Praises of rulers and their offspring and the dreams of sudden peace and bounty, all due to a new king, made much more sense in the pre-modern world, in which the protectors at the top were seen in a divine light. For the new issue of the journal that we are publishing, Interfaces, we put up this call for papers on the theory and phenomenology of love as it is represented in medieval literature. But we received a very surprising and very brilliant paper by Lorenzo Liborsi, and it's just been published. In this paper he shows that the language of love and longing developed by the most prominent erotic poet of the Roman Empire, Ovid, was reused some centuries later in order to shower the emperor with love and affection, and again in the early Middle Ages by a poet, Fortunatus, who praises a high officer of the Frankish king in erotic terms. While such language is informed by a literary tradition, it still gives us access, I would claim, to the deep devotion often felt by medieval subjects. Let me also quote the praise of the greatest Danish medieval author, Saxo Grammaticus. There's a new English translation of him that I'm quoting from. This is the famous Boje fragment, so Saxo's draft copy that we have a little fragment of in the Royal Library. Let me just quote this from the beginning of his history, where he's talking about Valdemar, so that this is the Valdemar II, the victorious. So, my gracious Lord and Father of us all, brilliant light of our country, Valdemar, whose illustrious descent from early times I will be describing, I beg you to look kindly on the wavering course of this labor, for I fear that I shall be shackled by the weight of my subject, and far from properly depicting your lineage, I shall sooner reveal my lack of aptitude and meager talents. By remarkably enlarging the wide realm inherited from your father, through subjugation of your neighbors, by encompassing in the toil of extensive conquest the ebbing and flowing of the waters of the Elbe, you have added no mean element of glory to the distinguished register of your fame. Thus, by the scale of your achievements, you overleapt the reputation of your predecessors, even to the extent of making armed warfare on parts of the Holy Roman Empire. Everyone knows your well-practiced courage and philanthropy, so that one cannot measure which is greater, the terror struck into your foes on the battlefield, or the gratification felt by our citizens at your mildness. Your resplendent grandfather too, the sanctified object of public devotion, who achieved immortal glory through an undeserved death, now awes with his radiant holiness the people over whom he was once victorious. More valor than blood flowed from his venerable wounds. And the grandfather of Valdemar, Sire Valdemar the Victorious, is Knud Lavard, who is, and here's some of the genealogy. Knud Lavard and other Danish nobles and kings are buried in St. Bent in Ringsted. The ruler was talked of as a god walking the earth, and in this context of dynasty, it's especially instructive to see how much emphasis Saxo puts on the bloodline of Valdemar, and his famous father, Valdemar the Great, and his grandfather, Knud Lavard, who was really a half-god, namely a saint. The dynasty is the only guarantee for stability and continuity, and so much the better that it has so obvious a divine recognition. Being a saint meant that Knud Lavard was potentially present all the time, could be prayed to and invoked as a divine witness for oaths between noblemen. This is an example of how the immaterial bonds of human networks were tied very directly to a body of a man, in this case to his remains, which were interred in Ringsted. To visualize how important this type of embodiment of cultural memory and social continuity was in pre-modern societies, think of the lengths that the ancient Egyptians and Chinese went to in order to ensure that the continued bodily existence of the passed away kings, the elaborate mummification of the pharaohs, sons of gods, or the even more daunting jade suits that were made for Chinese rulers when they were interred. This is the same that happened to the bones of Knud Lavard, although it doesn't look as great as this. We have lost the powerful individual that held together human obligations, provided safety and justice, and communicated with God, or the gods. And by sacralizing the bodily remains, we make sure that his soul may be safe and still with us. In another metaphor, the ruler's human body is dead, but the body politic, symbolized by his exalted remains, lives on. And here I'm referring to a very famous book from the mid-20th century, and some claim it's one of the best books about medieval history written in the 20th century, The King's Two Bodies by Cantor Ulrich. The saintly nature of kings, whether they were pronounced saints and had a cult like Knud Lavard or not, should obviously be seen together with the entire crowd of saints, which were the link between this world and the beyond. For all aspects of social life, saints were intermediators and negotiators, and their earthly remains the concrete guarantee of a connection between past, present, and future. The saints also embodied social ideals of different kinds, from humility to bravery, and from serene simple-mindedness to deep wisdom. These are the kinds of things that we today write into constitutions, educational programs, and corporate values. And maybe some of you remember we were donated a cup in SDU with 3 values. I forgot what they were now, but this is the kind of association perhaps one should have. So the point is that I'm trying to make is simply that values, hopes, and aspirations in the Middle Ages were represented by a human body or the remains of a body, ultimately all related in the all-compassing body of Christ, the model God-man. So, to sum up the first part of my paper, in a modern comparison, rulers and lords in pre-modern societies lived risky and often short lives, but their personal importance was all the more striking. They truly embodied government, and an enormous emotional and religious effort were needed to carry over their dead bodies into the next body of government in order to have a body politic at all. To us this seems magical and strange, but just imagine how absolutely magical it would have seemed to them, how relaxed we are with the passing of government to someone new, because we have strong institutions and the divide between the lawmakers, the executives, and the judiciary, which actually exists nowhere but in our complex social minds and in a huge body of writings. How was the strong dominance of kinship and dynasty then challenged in the Middle Ages? It is a poor organizational principle, basically the default mode in lack of more sophisticated resources, but it was doing well on its own terms when alternatives began to be experimented with, beginning in the 11th and 12th centuries. Before I list some of the alternative forms of social organization, I just want to approach the aristocratic order a little bit through historical sociology, and I find the 4-tiered model here by Michael Mann attractive as a flexible version or a combination of Marxist and Weberian views. and it is unfolded in a grand narrative that he has given in his books. So Mann's proposal is to drop the concept of society as a starting point. It's always too vague anyway, and surprisingly hard to delimit, especially in the pre-modern age. Instead, he takes his point of departure in intersecting networks, and there are 4 fields of social action, or sources of power, as he calls it: ideology, economy, military, politics, the IEMP model. These 4 spheres have different separate logics, and importantly, have no predefined hierarchy amongst them. Important transformations of empires, states, or social groups can happen either due to the agenda set in the military sphere, or by economics, politics, or ideology, and in different combinations of these. Mann's model then also allows for the potential primacy of changes in the sphere he names ideology, which also then includes religion and all kinds of cultural, scientific, literary, and artistic expressions. So if we map a little bit our concerns about literature and learning onto this system, we can see the military sphere is present everywhere in the values and lifestyle of the nobility, and it is a dominant theme of medieval literature. In the course of the High Middle Ages, the European knighthood achieved a more integrated group identity through crusades and other things, new chivalric codes of honor, and they were also flirting with better manners. In both romances, chronicles, and law codes, we find an obvious and strong reflection of the fact that fighting on horseback was what gave the aristocracy their visible identity and social justification. Even non-noble authors who wrote romances like Chrétien de Troyes or chronicles highlighted the constant importance of war and the crucial honor that it brought to nobility. In economic terms, the aristocracy, of course, relied on owning the land in various complex hierarchies of dependency and entitlements. The most important feature, seen from a modern point of view, was that land was rarely sold, but was divided, assembled, and handed on through heritage and marriage, thus displaying the obvious link between dynasty and the chief resource of wealth in the medieval world. The actual working of the land was taken care of by despised serfs, tenants, and small freeholders, almost never mentioned in literature, and needless to say, without any voice in writing at all. The political domain was also completely dominated by the high nobility, and again the dynastic structures were the most important mechanism to extend influence. Politics and war were of course intimately connected, and the conflicts and conflict solving among the highest nobles was a source of honor which was celebrated in literature, or it was a source of dishonor which could then be processed, camouflaged, and negotiated through literature. In the ideological sphere, we encounter a more complex picture, and this is also where we meet different forms of alternative social organizations. On the one hand, the aristocratic values of honor and family are expressed quite directly, but on the other, they are surrounded and supported by a much more complex ideological system, that of the ever-evolving Christian belief. I have taken some very drastic shortcuts here, as the relation between social ideals and Christian moral and theological doctrine is a daunting topic in itself. In this context, it may be useful to begin by stating that it was in the ideological sphere in the 11th and 12th centuries that we see the first real alternative to kinship and dynastic organization. And this happens in the new organization of the monastic orders and of the secular clergy in the expanding episcopal structure of papal Europe. From the 11th century, the priests, and of course their masters, the bishops and so on, were expected to be celibate and in this way be extracted from the dominant kinship structure. And from the 12th and 13th century we get the new monastic orders, most famously the Cistercians, Franciscans and Dominicans, with their extremely strong corporate identities and European-wide networks. The key principle of social organization here is election by a college of the bishop, the pope, the abbot, or the master general of the order. The fact that the leaders in these organizations were not supposed to have offspring or to have other family benefit from their office was a radical break with the otherwise dominant dynastic principle. To a large degree, these principles were responsible for highly dynamic pockets of more rational organization. The Cistercians famously driving forward agricultural technology, while Franciscans and Dominicans shaped both universities and hospitals through the 13th century. And the universities were also strongly supported by the papacy, which in itself developed a bureaucracy during the 12th and 13th centuries, which would later be imitated by secular authorities and emerging nation states. And finally, the military orders served as elite troops. So in all of these, we see a much more efficient social organization, you can say, and dynamic. These ecclesiastical organizations without family concerns obviously need a very strong corporate and religious identity for their coherence in order to counteract the lack of kinship ties. You may want to object to this narrative in several ways. First of all, one could say that, well, the papacy and these orders, some orders have actually existed before the 11th and 12th, 13th centuries. Well, I can just say very briefly, maybe we can discuss it, but basically the way the church was living before the 11th century was very much tied to the local nobility and did not form a coherent international structure like this. And I should also say that I don't think that it's a very good idea to talk about the church as a political actor, especially not in the early period. There was never a church with specific goals throughout the Middle Ages, but if we try to put it in Michael Mann's framework, a number of intersecting and competing networks, all claiming to have a special role in the divine order. Another objection could be that the people in the ecclesiastical organizations, they were mainly recruited from the nobility itself, also in the period that I'm concentrating on here, and that their loyalty remained with these landowning noble families. This is certainly true to a large extent. The bonds of secular society were still strong, and certain conflicts between ecclesiastical organizations and secular powers can often be read as nobility conflicts in disguise. Yet, the growing strength of these organizations not operating directly on kinship principles did make a difference for how networks behaved, as did the strong corporate identity in the different types of Christian ideology they provided. All these organizations were led by people who were elected, typically by privileged groups of senior male members, and they were appointed for life. And this is important. This meant two things, pulling in two different directions. The election for office, however undemocratic it may seem from a modern point of view, necessarily emphasized an element of competence and education. In other words, of meritocratic values. The people at the top were qualified, or they were supposed to be. In practice, a great amount of nepotism, politics, etc. put many incompetent people in these positions, but it did mean that criticism could be formulated in terms of competence and lack of competence, which was entirely irrelevant in the aristocratic kinship order. What was drawing more in the traditional direction was the appointment for life. Think about where we still follow this principle in the 21st century. I don't know what comes to mind. Important positions where people are appointed for life.
The Pope.
Exactly. That's my first. That's my first example. The other example is something that's in the news all the time, namely the American Supreme Court. But it is exceptional today, And it creates a strange unpredictability in the whole organization. In the medieval context, we can note that appointment for life to a large degree perpetuated the embodiment of political power. The bishops, abbots, order generals, popes, etc. were entrusted with some of the same sacrality as kings and the high nobility. In spite of the non-kinship electoral process, the transfer of power must still have had some of the connotations of the transfer of secular power from one respected, perhaps even sacralized, dead body to another living body. But the guarantee of proper transfer rested with an institutionalized college rather than the bloodline. And this leads us to the third and final organizational principle, which you may already have guessed. Collegial bodies whose heads are appointed not by kinship, nor for life. And I'm thinking in particular of these three. So city communes, mainly in Italy, guilds in all major towns, and universities from around 1200. The idea that qualified people go into retirement or rotate frequently at the head of an organization has become second nature to us. This is how most entities, public and private, function today. But in the Middle Ages, it was the most innovative form. In all three instances, it is related to the remarkable urbanization of all over Europe in the period between the mid-11th century and 1300. The main resources behind the communes, guilds and universities were urban, that is to a large degree based on the wealth of trade and crafts rather than land. They were all held together by the swearing of oaths and gradually by written statutes and recognized legal status. In all three cases, it was a haphazard and confused process which led to the innovation, not any premeditated plan, but the result of unexpected pressures and possibilities. And this is stressed by this fairly new authoritative book on the Italian communes. You see it's called Sleepwalking into a New World, the emergence of Italian city communes in the 12th century, that this was not a premeditated process. While many Italian cities turned to dynastic lordship again in the 13th century, this did not mean that town magistrates with rotating offices were obsolete, and indeed we find them over most of Europe in the later Middle Ages. A city governance structure of this type functioned together with guilds, the corporations of artisans and merchants, which emerged also in the 12th century, and which became a major organizational force in late medieval towns. Guilds were basically urban professional self-help groups, and the equality of the accepted members and their elected representatives made them a key instance in this category. I just hasten on to the last one, which is the universities, and which is of course more important for intellectual history. The first universities came into view around 1200, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Salerno, and other places. What you need to know very briefly in this context is simply they emerged basically as guilds for students and teachers, but quickly found themselves between conflicting interests of towns and local secular and ecclesiastical authorities. And through the active support of the papacy, the teachers and students' unions then acquired a common governance which could represent the whole organization. These organizations developed, like the communes, in a haphazard manner, but the bottom line is that during the 13th century, we suddenly have a number of intellectually powerful institutions whose leadership principle is rotation. At one point in this development, the Franciscan and Dominican professors were so strong, especially in Paris, that the university might have opted for lifelong leadership, but it did not happen. And by refusing to go that way, they became the be curious institutions that we favor today, and even with their papal backing, they were driving theology, philosophy, and other branches of knowledge into unforeseen and uncontrollable waters. How does literature and the values expressed through intellectual culture tie in with these patterns? In my search for an alternative to the aristocratic kinship order, I have found that there is no such thing as the values of a supposedly unified church, opposed to aristocracy or king. This is a classic opposition in historical writing, but I don't think that the study of literature bears this out. And only occasionally is there a one-to-one relationship between the social position of an author and the values he or she espouses. Writers of aristocratic origins may have been leading university intellectuals like Thomas Aquinas. Non-aristocratic writers may be hired hands, singing the praises and shaping the fantasies of the knightly class. And historians like Saxo Grammaticus, employed in a medium-high position in the episcopal hierarchy, may promote a die-hard warrior lifestyle. In order to understand the ever-growing meritocratic voices in the High and Late Middle Ages, we need to look at those more fundamental features, namely what I've been talking about, new forms of social organization, and also the power of writing itself. And as for the organizational forms, I have already made my point clear. I think with an ever-increasing impact of both ecclesiastical and secular organizations without kinship inheritance, no matter how elitist or closed in other ways, the idea that literary education was needed could not help spreading. When the head of an organization was elected for life, there was still a fair amount of sacralization of that person as the embodied carrier of common values. But in the towns, guilds, and universities, the values were attached to a more abstract entity. And in this way, the cracks had developed in the aristocratic edifice when it became clearer that competence and merit, the resulting networks of power, could very well exist without an aristocratic bloodline. And the second point concerns the specifics of writing and literary culture. And there are two sides of this coin. A certain amount of written texts were necessary to keep up and develop both the ecclesiastical and secular organizations, and especially the papacy, the Dominicans, and the universities made it their specialty to cultivate and enlarge this body of writing. And this affected bureaucratic, legal, theological, philosophical, scientific, and literary, in our sense of literary, writing. And it was the basis of, it was with the same basis of education that was needed for all of them. This being the case, now think of the perspective of an individual who acquired the literate and learned skills, especially someone who might not come from the absolute highest social levels. To master this art and become a notary, lawyer, chronicler, theologian, or even poet was an enormous privilege which opened a world of possibilities in just one generation. The resources of the great tradition, in the words of the anthropologist Redfield, were at your fingertips in a matter of 15 or 20 years of education. A shocking shortcut in comparison with the nobility whose great tradition of family honor took hundreds and hundreds of years to acquire. The power of writing can perhaps be said to have an inbuilt meritocratic mechanism. This mechanism is something I still want to explore, but I do think its potentially inherent dynamic is overlooked by Michael Mann's model, in which learning and literature belonging to ideology will tend to appear as passive reflections rather than shapers of new social relations. I'm just at the end now. These medieval innovations happened gradually and were not necessarily noticed by the social groups and individuals involved. Moreover, emergent social phenomena do not get new iconic names just when they appear. They have to borrow from existing ideas and vocabulary, and can thus be camouflaged both for contemporaries and for modern scholars. And I just want to finish by giving you two examples of this. In the noble kinship warrior order of things, honor was a key concept. If you read modern books about medieval history, there will be extensive discussions of power, influence, and resources, but these were mostly talked of then as honor. A man of honor directly implied a landowning nobleman and the honor of the family or dynasty was firmly attached to the head of the family and to his or her physical being. It was the honor accrued through generations that had to be transferred physically to the next heir. In other words, honor was always embodied. From the beginning of the 12th century we find, as has been argued by Bernweiser in this book, we find a lot of Italian documents that begin to talk about honor civitatis, so the honor of the city. While the city did indeed have physical symbolic presence, for instance in its main monuments or in its patron saint, and I have a picture here of the 13th, 14th century town hall of Siena, on which ours here in Odense is based. So while the communes, the cities did have a physical symbolic presence, it is still striking to have such an embodied concept of honor transferred from the world of nobility to that of the abstract community of the city. And my final example concerns the concept of noble and nobility itself. And so Dante, and this is from another work, but this is a Renaissance portrait of Dante Alighieri, he discusses in his rich but unfinished treatise on poetics, learning and authority, the Convivio, written shortly before the Divine Comedy around 1308. He discusses nobility, and here he quotes, he starts by saying, one ruler of the empire described nobility, and from the context we actually know whom he's thinking of here. It is our friend from before, Frederick II, the Hohenstaufen emperor. He had said, described nobility as consisting in his view of age-old wealth together with pleasing manners. And someone else of a shallower cast of mind, after mulling over this dictum, dispensed with the last feature because he himself perhaps did not actually possess it. They all follow in his steps, who count a man noble if he comes from a family that has been very rich for a considerable time. So entrenched has this quite false opinion become in our society that people call any man noble who can say, I am the grandson or son of such and such, a worthy person, even if he himself is a good for nothing. Dante goes on to explain in his own poem and discuss the concept of nobility. And he argues strongly against Frederick's twofold definition in which nobility consists of old wealth and manners. Instead, Dante links it to a number of virtues and the search for knowledge and wisdom. In fact, wealth can often be detrimental to real nobility because it is a distraction. In this radical revision of the term nobility, Dante has completed the move from embodied nobility to disembodied, and he implies that nobility can be acquired, in principle, by anyone within a single generation. In his clear treatment of the issue, we can see how learning and literature, meritocracy and abstraction go hand in hand. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lars. We have time for questions. Actually, I sort of one, but it's quite pedestrian. So it goes like this. So continuity through bloodline, I thought was very fascinating. And then fast forward to our colleagues in economics that would say continuity through property rights. And so in between that, you pointed to some sources of that transition, but it seems more or less to be where we are. And one part of that is codification through writing, and how that facilitated then legal rules and using those and as a context for promoting property rights. Now, going back to what you presented here, how does that strike you? Is that too simplified a picture? Of course it is. But sort of, what's the stuff in the Middle Ages? So you pointed to the disembodiment in a way of nobility. I found that fascinating. So the disembodiment of also the bloodline, so to say, to property rights. Could you point to a bit more here, or?
Yes, I'm
Was it
very,
just a projection?
very relevant question. I'm not a legal historian myself, so I'm sure there is a lot to say from that point of view. But it is exactly in this time of legal history, in the universities in 12th and 13th century, that a discussion of property rights and also of economy takes place. But I think when I said that the aristocratic order continues until the 17th or 18th century and so on, it is just because of the simple fact that we need to have the three powers separated in order to see how we work in the modern world.
Right.
And that's just it was just a way of saying let's try and get rid of that and imagine a world before that, where actually all issues that came up through this hierarchy was one hierarchy. It was yeah, you couldn't go to the judge and get another opinion because that was the judge. So
Lars, I wanted to bring up two things that might complicate this a little bit. One is in the notion of idoneity, or idonius, because there was often a case where nobles would be judged as incapable of carrying out, they had the opportunity to carry out certain tasks because they were noble, but they were judged incapable of doing it and then set aside. And one example is there's a count of the heir to the county of Hainaut, who they decided that he was too simple to be involved in aristocratic life, and so they sent him off to the church. But there is this notion that it's not simply your bloodline, but then you also have to be capable of carrying out the tasks which you're supposed to be able to carry out. So it's I think it complicates a little bit the notion between aristocracy and meritocracy, and that you're an aristocrat, but you also have to be able to do very physically what an aristocrat is supposed to be able to do. And then on the other end, there's the question for, I don't know what it is in Danish law, but in American law, that if I die intestate without a will, my property is distributed equally among my heirs, so that our legal system is still, and I've often talked to my students about this, that I may not find my children worthy of inheriting, but they're the ones that the law say are going to inherit. So.
No, thank you for that. This was quite a black and white sketch I made here. But I think that so in terms of the very important heirs to dukes and kings and so on, there you would actually accept a lot of inability, and they would still be the heir. But no, thank you for that.
Okay. Oh.
Yes, I was curious about technology. I mean, you named the guilds and monastic orders. I suppose that they were part of it. I mean, who owned the technology? Who knew and who spread it in Europe, say? That's my question to you.
That's a big question. I guess among the artisans there were certain traditions that were also kept to themselves, but there was no copyright, so there was no there wasn't a copyright of ideas.
But how did the thing spread? I mean, if you get a good idea, I mean, innovations in agriculture and so on, I mean, they spread through those elite networks, basically. I don't know, Thomas, if you...
It's word of mouth. It's one of those wonderful riddles of medieval history that what you've got for technology is not written down, but if you look at cathedrals, for instance, these are clearly masterpieces. We have no idea exactly how they built them, but there's a sort of, well, you could say, inherent knowledge, but also, I mean, these are traveling artisans, so that they'll teach each other, but this is very hard for us to map. And during the late Middle Ages, you see increasingly guilds that they come together with the people that Lars have described. So it gets worlds to meet. Again, the guild as Lars talked about, and the monastic all of that. So there's accumulation of this sort of knowledge that eventually gets written down.
So there isn't a medieval equivalent of Apple, for instance, of Facebook.
No, no, not that we know
For many
of.
reasons.
Okay.
All right, Niklas?
Yeah, thank you very much for this, what I think was a great reminder to not sort of, or not underestimate the Middle Ages, how, you know, if you come from sociology, you have Weber or Durkheim, and for them sort of functional differentiation and the importance of organization sort of starts with a modern society, sort of shortcutting or shortchanging, I think, the complexity before. My question is this though, I mean, isn't these kind of organizations like guilds or universities, isn't that just kind of a very different animal than states? I mean, you sort of label them both as communities, but I mean, a state, for example, you know, or these organizations are organized around physical or spatial proximity, right? Often the same building, the same city. There are people that share very particular sets of knowledge, and embodied knowledge and tools and so on. Whereas the states require some form of imagined community, as we would say in sociology.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, even today, you know, the Trump followers call him the God Emperor, which is sort of only half ironic, I think. So in some sense, in some way, we still, you know, like to look up to maybe Churchill or Charles de Gaulle or whatever in these kind of idealizing functions, which is sort of has a functional reason.
No, thank you. No, you're absolutely right. That, I mean, there's a very big discussion about state formation and so on, and it's been a long trend of research in the sort of late Middle Ages and early modern period of the state formation. But basically, you're right that what I'm talking about, and that's why I call it abstract communities rather than imagined communities, because those communities were actually close, as you say, universities and towns and so on. They did see each other, but it became an abstract legal entity. It could, there was something that suddenly could act on behalf of everyone, and that was a new thing, especially that it was not invested into one person. That was a new thing. But so in a way, yeah, compared to states, whenever we want to say that they developed, whether it's in the 16th century or what, there's a lot of huge, much more complex structures, and that's absolutely true. That's worth thinking about. Thank you.
A very last question.
I have a question and a partial answer along the same lines. I was wondering if these can be also the basis for a new kind of allegiances. I was thinking of the military orders, for instance, the Knights of Malta, where it's true that they had a physical place where they met, but they were organized in houses named according to the different nations, House of France, House of Italy, House of England, and also they were spread all over Europe for the attacks. So it was abstract and it was a community and not based on blood relationships. So do you think that these can be a basis for?
I just briefly mentioned them, but absolutely, yeah. That's a good supplement.
Right. So thank you so much, Lars, and we have a little gift here for you.
Oh, yeah.
This is something to. And thanks so much for the talk.
Yeah.